There's a face you can still find along the western edge of Ireland that does not match what most people picture when they hear the word Irish. Not the freckled skin and copper hair everyone expects. Something else, coal black hair. Skin so pale it looks almost blue in certain light, and eyes that carry the gray-green color of the ocean right before a storm. For hundreds of years, people looked at this face and could not explain it, so they made up stories instead. Spanish sailors, Viking warriors, wandering knights. Every explanation sounded reasonable enough to repeat in a pub, and every single one of them turns out to be false. This look has a name that has floated around Ireland for generations, the Black Irish. Nobody could ever agree on where the phrase came from or what it truly meant. Some say it started as a way locals described neighbors who looked different from the rest of the townland. Others say it was a term used by immigrants abroad, a way of separating one kind of Irish face from another kind of Irish face when they landed in America or Australia. Whatever the origin of the words themselves, the guesses people made about the biology behind the look all pointed toward the same idea: foreigners arriving from somewhere else and leaving their mark on the population. It felt logical. A dramatic shipwreck, a violent invasion, a secret bloodline hiding in plain sight for centuries. These are the kinds of stories people love to tell around a fire, passed from grandparent to grandchild, growing a little more colorful with every retelling. For a long time, there was no way to actually test any of it. You could look at a dark-haired, pale-skinned family in a fishing village and guess about Spanish blood, and nobody could prove you wrong. The story simply had to be believed or dismissed based on how convincing it sounded. That changed once laboratories learned how to read the actual code written inside human cells. Suddenly, guesswork was no longer good enough. Science, however, does not care what makes a good story. Genetic researchers went looking for the real answer. They didn't find it in any old ship's log or battle record. They found it buried inside human bones that are thousands of years older than any of those legends, pulled from quiet graves that had been sitting undisturbed since long before Rome existed, long before Christianity reached the island, long before anyone had ever written down the word Ireland. What they uncovered doesn't just poke a hole in the old explanations. It erases them completely and replaces them with something far stranger and far older than anyone expected. A story that stretches back not centuries, but millennia. Let's start with the story most people already know, because it is the one that gets repeated the most. In the year 1588, Spain sent a massive naval fleet to invade England. That fleet was torn apart by brutal storms, and pieces of it were pushed onto the rocky coastline of Ireland. Sailors who survived the wrecks staggered onto Irish beaches, their skin darker and their hair black compared to the local population. According to the legend, these men settled down, found Irish wives, and had children. And somewhere among those children, the story goes, the Black Irish were born. It's a great story. It has drama, tragedy, and romance all wrapped into one. Shipwrecked strangers washing up on a foreign shore, taken in by local families, falling in love, starting new lives far from home. It practically writes itself as a film script. The only problem is that it isn't true. When scientists actually studied Irish DNA looking for a Spanish signature tied to that shipwreck, they found nothing, no measurable trace. Not in the coastal counties where the wreck supposedly happened, and not anywhere else on the island either. The math simply doesn't work, and it never really did once you sit down and think about the numbers honestly. Historians estimate that only a few thousand Spanish sailors survived the disaster along the entire Irish coastline, and many of those who did make it to shore were hunted down and killed rather than welcomed into local communities, since Ireland at the time was under English control and harboring Spanish soldiers carried serious risk. Of the small number who actually settled and had families, their numbers were far too tiny to leave any lasting fingerprint on a population that already numbered in the hundreds of thousands. A handful of surviving sailors scattered along hundreds of miles of rugged coastline could never influence the genetics of an entire nation, no matter how many children they had or how many generations passed. The story survived because it was emotionally satisfying, not because it was accurate. It gave people a tidy explanation for something that actually had no tidy explanation at all, at least not one that fit inside a few generations of human memory. Next comes the Viking theory, and this one at least has some real evidence behind it. Norse raiders attacked Ireland repeatedly between the 9th and 11th centuries. They built the city of Dublin and settled heavily along the eastern coast. When geneticists checked, they did find a real and measurable amount of Scandinavian ancestry in Irishmen, particularly through the male line. That part is genuine. But here's the catch. That Viking genetic signal is concentrated almost entirely in the east, in the port cities the Norse actually built. It is not found in the places where the Black Irish look is strongest, places like Kerry, Cork, and Galway, way out on the western coast. The Vikings barely touched those regions. The Norman invaders who arrived a few centuries later left an even smaller mark, mostly among noble families in the east. Neither group can explain a look that is centered hundreds of miles away from where they actually settled. To find the true origin, You have to throw out the entire medieval period and travel back much, much further, all the way to around 2,500 years before Christ. Picture Ireland at that time, stone circles being raised on open hillsides. Farming communities, working land that their ancestors, who had sailed up from the Mediterranean thousands of years earlier, had settled long before. These people had their own distinct genetic identity, one that had been building for generations, and that identity was about to be almost completely wiped out. A new group of people began arriving from mainland Europe. They brought bronze tools, a distinctive style of pottery decorated with bell-shaped patterns, and something even more important than either of those things, a completely different set of genes. This group is known today as the Bell Beaker culture, named simply after the shape of the drinking vessels found buried alongside them. They didn't arrive as one single dramatic wave. It happened in stages, spreading outward from continental Europe across Britain and then across the Irish Sea, but the end result was just as total as if it had happened overnight. What happened after they arrived in Britain and Ireland was not a slow, peaceful mixing of two populations, sharing land and customs side by side for generations. Genetic studies now show it was closer to a replacement. Within just a few centuries, the vast majority of the existing Irish gene pool was gone, swapped out for something new almost entirely. This same pattern shows up across much of Britain during the exact same period, which tells researchers this wasn't some isolated local event. It was part of a much larger continental shift that reshaped the genetic map of an enormous stretch of Europe. Nobody is entirely sure whether this happened through migration, disease, conflict, or some combination of all three. Some researchers point to new farming and herding techniques that would have let the newcomers support larger populations on the same land, slowly outcompeting the older communities. Others point to evidence of violence and upheaval in the archaeological record from that period. Most likely it was a mix of all of these pressures working together over generations. But regardless of the exact cause, the genetic outcome is undeniable. The Ireland that existed before these newcomers arrived effectively vanished, and a new population, carrying new genes, stepped into its place. The proof for this isn't theoretical. On Rathlin Island, off the northern coast of Ireland, archaeologists dug up the remains of Bronze Age men who were buried somewhere between 2500 and 2000 BC. When their DNA was tested, it revealed a paternal genetic marker known as R1bL21. That exact same marker shows up today in more than 65% of Irish men. In other words, those ancient bones weren't just old skeletons. They were the direct forefathers of millions of people living in Ireland right now. These new arrivals also carried a gene that allowed adults to digest milk, something most humans couldn't do before that point in history. As dairy farming became central to Irish life, that gene spread rapidly, and today Ireland has one of the highest rates of lactose tolerance found anywhere on the planet. The Bell Beaker people also carried genetic variants for lighter skin and lighter eyes, and those traits spread quickly through the population as well. But not everything about the old population disappeared. The genes responsible for dark hair didn't vanish. In certain families, in certain corners of the island, those older genes held their ground. And that stubborn survival is really where the story of the Black Irish begins. So far, we've only been talking about the male side of the story because the genetic marker passed from father to son is easy to trace and tells a clear, dramatic tale of sudden change. But there is a second bloodline running underneath it, quieter and far more patient, and it comes through the mothers. Mitochondrial DNA passes from a mother to her children and stays almost completely unchanged generation after generation. It's one of the most stable records we have in human genetics. And in Ireland, this maternal record tells a story of remarkable continuity rather than sudden upheaval. The most common maternal genetic group in Ireland today is called haplogroup H, carried by roughly a third of Irish women, with especially strong concentrations in two specific branches. These lineages trace directly back to early farming communities and to the Bronze Age migrants who arrived alongside them. But older signals are still there too, layered underneath. A meaningful number of Irish women carry a much older maternal lineage known as haplogroup U, specifically a branch called U5. And this one connects directly back to the very first humans who set foot on the island after the last ice age ended, more than 7,000 years ago. These were people hunting and fishing along Ireland's wild Atlantic coastline long before farming, long before metalworking, long before any of the later invasions people usually talk about. Here's the part that matters most for solving the mystery of the Black Irish. Many of these maternal lineages have their closest genetic matches not in Britain, but across the water in France, Iberia, and along the wider Atlantic coastline of Europe. This points to ancient sea routes, families traveling by boat along the coast, long before any Viking longship ever appeared on the horizon. Some of these lineages carried the genetic instructions for dark hair, and those instructions kept getting passed down even as lighter traits were spreading through the rest of the population. So while the fathers brought sudden, sweeping transformation, the mothers quietly preserved something older underneath it. Together, These two threads created the wide genetic range that eventually produced the Black Irish look. If you actually want to see this face in real life, you need to travel west. Kerry, Cork, Galway. Land defined by stone walls, crashing Atlantic cliffs, and families who have worked the exact same small valleys for more generations than anyone bothers to count anymore. There is something genuinely different about these places, and it's not just about culture or history, it's written into the genes. In 2017, a research effort called the Irish DNA Atlas Project, run by scientists from the Royal College of Surgeons and Trinity College Dublin, studied people whose grandparents all came from the same specific regions of the country. What they discovered completely broke apart the idea that Ireland has one single uniform population. Instead, they found 10 separate genetic clusters spread across the island. Most of these clusters carried a heavy weight of ancient Gaelic Irish ancestry, and the oldest, most distinct clusters of all were concentrated out west. Counties like Kerry and Cork showed a much stronger genetic connection to Bronze Age Ireland than anywhere else on the island. The same ancient lineage found in those bones on Rathlin Island, the same bloodline that arrived with the Bell Beaker people and simply never left. While most of the country carries a noticeable trace of Norwegian-style ancestry from centuries of Viking settlement, the western clusters largely missed out on that influence. Later arrivals barely reached them at all. These communities stayed genetically closer to their Bronze Age ancestors than to their own neighbors on the eastern side of the island. There's a scientific reason isolation works this way. It's called the founder effect. When a small population becomes cut off from outside influence for enough generations, rare genetic traits don't just survive, they actually become more common over time. The unusual mix of black hair alongside pale skin and light eyes had exactly the right conditions. Out west, it became a stable, recurring feature across entire communities. Culture reinforced what geography protected. The west of Ireland was the last stronghold of the Irish language, of traditional music, of tightly knit communities that married within their own small networks for centuries. Cultural identity and genetic identity moved together in the same direction for a very long time. So when you spot the Black Irish face somewhere out west, you're not looking at some strange exception. You're looking at the oldest, continuously preserved genetic lineage still living on the island. Now let's talk about the actual biology behind all of this, because it comes down to a single gene called MC1R. This gene acts as the main switch controlling hair and skin pigmentation in humans, and Ireland has one of the strangest relationships with this gene found anywhere on Earth. Certain variants of MC1R are directly responsible for red hair. A handful of specific mutations each raise the odds of someone having red hair and freckles, and Ireland carries the highest concentration of these mutations found anywhere in the world. That's the real reason roughly 1 in 10 Irish people has naturally red hair, compared to a global average sitting under 2%. That part of the myth is genuinely true. But here's where things get interesting, and where the simple explanations start to fall apart. Carrying one of these red hair gene variants does not automatically mean someone will actually have red hair. Pigmentation isn't controlled by a single switch flipping on or off. It's more like a tug of war between two competing systems. On one side, genes responsible for producing melanin push the body toward darker hair. On the other side, MC1R mutations work to weaken that melanin signal. Whichever system wins that particular contest determines what color hair actually grows in. This means a person can carry a red hair gene and still end up with jet black hair if their melanin-producing genes are strong enough to overpower it. This isn't some rare fluke. It happens inside Irish families constantly. One sibling with hair the color of fire, sitting right next to a sibling with hair as dark as midnight, both born to the exact same parents, both carrying pieces of the exact same gene pool, just landing on different outcomes of the same internal contest. Anyone who grew up in a large Irish family has probably seen this firsthand without ever knowing the biology behind it, wondering how two children from the same household could look so different from each other. The genetic variants pushing toward dark pigmentation aren't recent arrivals either. Ancient DNA confirms they were already present in Ireland during the farming era, carried by Mediterranean settlers thousands of years before the Bronze Age. Newcomers introduced their lighter traits into the mix. Skeletal remains from Neolithic tombs across Ireland, some of them thousands of years older than the Bell Beaker arrivals, already carry the genetic markers linked to dark hair and darker eyes. These weren't traits introduced later. They were already baked into the island's population long before anyone we'd recognize as genetically modern Irish had even arrived. These two systems collided, competed against each other, and never fully settled the argument. Instead of one trait completely wiping out the other, as sometimes happens with genetic replacement, both sets of instructions kept getting passed down side by side, generation after generation, waiting to be triggered by whatever combination showed up in any given child. That's why Ireland today produces both extremes at once. Some of the palest, most freckled, most fiery red-headed people in the world, and some of the darkest-haired, palest-skinned people you'll find anywhere in Europe, often within the very same family tree. The Black Irish face isn't some import from a foreign land. It's It's what happens when a much older genetic line simply refuses to lose, holding its ground inside the DNA for 4,000 years and counting. Even Irish surnames carry pieces of this same biological story. Take the Nail dynasty, a family that held enormous political power across large parts of Ireland for centuries, claiming descent from the legendary King Niall of the Nine Hostages. Genetic research has found that a significant number of men across northwest Ireland today share the exact same Y chromosome lineage tied to that ruling family, a specific branch of that same R1b-L21 group we mentioned earlier, connected all the way back to the Bell Beaker arrivals. One royal bloodline, one genetic signature, still clearly visible across an entire region more than 1,000 years later. And that region sits right in the west and northwest, the exact same geography most closely tied to the Black Irish appearance. But it wasn't only powerful dynasties that shaped this genetic story. Tragedy played its part too. Between 1845 and 1852, the Great Famine devastated Ireland, collapsing the population from roughly 8 million people down to around 4 million in less than a single decade. Death and mass emigration emptied entire villages almost overnight. The genetic consequence of that disaster was harsh, but simple to understand. When half a population disappears, the genes carried by the people who remain get amplified within the survivors. Traits that might have stayed rare instead became defining features of whatever community was left standing. In the west of Ireland, where isolation had already been concentrating unusual pigmentation genes for generations, the famine acted like a final filter, locking those traits even more firmly into place. There's another genetic clue tied to survival too, something doctors sometimes call the Celtic curse. It's a mutation that causes the body to store too much iron, which is dangerous by modern standards, but was likely a genuine survival advantage back when food was scarce and unreliable for long stretches of time. This mutation shows up at its highest rate anywhere in the world, right in Western Ireland, and its deep presence there suggests roots stretching back long before recorded history even began. It's a reminder that the people who shaped the Black Irish appearance survived hardships that would have wiped out plenty of other populations entirely. Modern genetic science eventually delivered the final piece of confirmation, not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the sheer accumulated weight of countless genome studies comparing large samples of the Irish population against the wider genetic record of Europe. And the picture that emerged was remarkably precise. Irish ancestry breaks down into 3 ancient sources. Roughly a third traces back to hunter-gatherers who returned to the island once the Ice Age finally retreated. Another third, or possibly more, comes from early farmers who sailed north from the Mediterranean region, bringing crops, livestock, and dark pigmentation genes that never fully disappeared from the population. The remaining share arrived with the herding peoples, whose Bronze Age migration reshaped the genetics of the entire European continent. This 3-way balance has stayed remarkably stable for close to 4,000 years now, a level of genetic continuity that very few populations anywhere in Europe can honestly claim. Later arrivals did leave marks, just not evenly across the island. Viking influence stayed concentrated in the eastern port cities. Norman genetic traces mostly showed up among aristocratic families in the east. Later, plantation settlements left their fingerprint in the north, but the west of Ireland absorbed almost none of it. What modern genetics has confirmed lines up exactly with what the landscape and old oral traditions had been suggesting all along. The western counties of Ireland were never truly overwritten by later invasions and migrations. The oldest genetic layer survived there, mostly intact. And that Black Irish face, still looking back at you from those windswept Atlantic communities, isn't some unsolved mystery anymore. It is simply the oldest face in Ireland, still recognizable after 4,000 years. That face on Ireland's west coast was never some strange accident of history. It wasn't left behind by a shipwreck, and it wasn't carved into the population by a raiding party. It is the most direct living link to the very people who built those ancient stone circles, who lived through the sweeping genetic transformation of the Bronze Age, who held their bloodlines together through centuries of isolation and hardship, and who endured everything history threw at a small island sitting on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. The old myths were always easier to believe than the actual truth. A story about Spanish sailors sounds far more exciting than 4,000 years of quiet, unbroken genetic continuity. Viking warriors make for a much better tale than the slow, stubborn persistence of ancient pigmentation genes in communities that simply never got diluted enough to lose them. Those romantic explanations survived for so long only because nobody had studied the bones closely enough to challenge them. Now the DNA has finally been read, and what it reveals isn't complicated at all. The Black Irish were never outsiders. They were never some strange mystery brought in from somewhere else, never the result of an outside force passing through and leaving a mark behind. They are the original face of the island itself, protected out west by geography, by culture, and by sheer stubborn survival through everything the centuries threw at them. Think about everything that population had to live through and still remain recognizable. The upheaval of the Bronze Age transformation. Centuries of Viking raids along the coast, Norman armies pushing in from the east, plantations and conquest reshaping land ownership across the island, famine that erased half the population within a single decade, waves of emigration that scattered millions of Irish descendants across the world. Through every single one of those events, a genetic thread out in the West stayed intact, quietly holding on while everything around it changed. Identity is rarely as simple as a stereotype makes it sound, and Ireland is a perfect example of that. The very same island that gave the world its famous red hair, its freckles, its pale sunburned skin was quietly holding onto something even older underneath it the entire time, tucked away in the valleys and along the cliffs where isolation let it survive undisturbed. It never actually left. It never needed rediscovering because the people carrying it never stopped being there. It just took science this long to catch up, to finally read the evidence carefully enough to prove what the west of Ireland never actually forgot in the first place. The next time you see that face, the black hair, the pale skin, the sea-colored eyes, you're not looking at a mystery. You're looking at Ireland's oldest surviving story, written not in any book, but in the DNA itself.